The city of Granada basked in the golden light of a Spanish summer. Cobblestone streets glimmered after a sudden drizzle, and the scent of orange blossoms drifted through the alleyways of the Albayacin. But beneath the beauty, something stirred. Isabella Martin, a determined radio journalist in her early 30s, adjusted the microphone in her modest studio tucked behind a bakery on Calle de San Juan. Her show, La Voz de Medianoche, had a small but loyal following. She covered forgotten stories, those that mainstream media left behind. That night, as thunder rumbled over the Alhambra, she prepared to broadcast a segment about a mysterious fire that destroyed the abandoned Monasterio de Santa Rosa. An electrical fault, the official report had said. But Isabella had her doubts. She reached into her drawer and pulled out an old cassette tape, unmarked and dusty. It had arrived 3 days ago in a plain envelope with no return address. The postmark read Sevilla. When she played it, the static gave way to a trembling voice, a child's whisper, barely audible. She never left, she watches us still. That voice had haunted Isabella since. No timestamp, no context. But something about it felt real. Urgent. The tape ended with a scream. Not loud. Not terrified. But hollow, like someone screaming into a void. Her colleague, Alejandro Ruiz, a sound engineer with a background in paranormal investigations, entered the studio. "That's no child," he said after analyzing the frequency. "Or, if it is, it's not alive." Isabella scoffed. "You mean it's a ghost?" "I mean," Alejandro said, "we need to find out who recorded this." He placed a marked map of southern Spain on the desk. Several locations were circled. Abandoned churches, burnt homes, a village that vanished after a flood. These are places linked to the same phenomenon. Whispering voices, faint music, and then silence. Isabella traced a finger over the nearest circle, Cortijo el Sussurro, a derelict farmhouse half a day's drive from Granada. The name meant whisper farm. Outside, rain began to fall again. A lightning flash briefly lit the Sierra Nevada in the distance. "I'll go," Isabella said. "Tomorrow." Alejandro raised an eyebrow. "Alone? I need to know what's hiding in that silence." As the clock struck midnight, the radio flickered, static surged through the studio, and the tape played itself again, this time ending with 3 words in perfect Castilian. "El alma espera." The soul waits. The next morning, Isabella sat hunched over her desk, the cassette player spinning quietly as another tape played. Alejandro paced nearby, trying to make sense of what they had heard. The voice on the second tape was different, older, weathered, and deeply sorrowful. "Catalina, I still hear you in the stone, in the flame, in the ash. They say you screamed until the air cracked." Alejandro stopped mid-step. "Catalina." That name was on one of the tapes. Isabella nodded. "And now it's on too." She scribbled notes furiously. The voice referred to an event, something devastating. There was mention of fire, of betrayal. It was a confession, perhaps. Or a warning. But not directed at the living. They spent the next few hours researching old records from the village of Orgiva, near where Cortijo el Sussurro stood. It had a long, stubborn history. Some records had been digitized, others lost. But one name appeared again and again in scattered accounts from the 1940s. Catalina Ramos, a schoolteacher, accused of inciting rebellion during the civil unrest that swept through rural Spain after the war. She was said to have been taken to an isolated farmhouse for questioning. The farmhouse was never named, only referred to as La Casa que no hablaba, the house that did not speak. "She vanished," Isabella whispered. "No trial. No grave." Alejandro frowned. "They burned the house to erase what happened. But it didn't work, did it?" That night, they returned to Cortijo el Sussurro. This time, they entered the barn. The roof had collapsed inward, exposing broken beams and scorched hay bales. Among the debris, Isabella found a rusted lantern and something else, an old book, wrapped in wax cloth, charred at the edges, but still legible. Inside were diary entries, written in a slanted, hurried hand. The last few pages were smudged with soot, but one passage chilled her. They have silenced the others. I hear their voices echo in the night. I will be next, but I will speak until I burn. Isabella stared at the words for a long time. She turned to Alejandro. Do you think it's real? That she recorded her voice after? Alejandro shook his head slowly. This is something else. Something that holds on to memory like a wound. Suddenly, the radio crackled to life again. No one had touched it. A new voice this time.
Calm.
Measured. You are close, Isabella. But you are not the first to come searching. Alejandro grabbed the radio, but it slipped from his hands, crashing to the floor. It didn't break. It simply stopped. Then the barn door creaked open behind them. They turned slowly. The field was empty, but the scent of smoke was fresh. The following day, the sky over Orgiva turned a dull gray, clouds hanging low as if burdened by memory. Isabella and Alejandro drove into the village, hoping to speak with someone who might remember what happened in the hills all those years ago. They visited the municipal archive first. Dusty cabinets, faded photographs, and rolls of microfilm. It was Alejandro who uncovered a reference tucked inside a land registry ledger, a mention of La Casa de Ramos, marked as condemned property in 1951. It was the same year Catalina disappeared. Next to the entry, someone had scribbled a note in pencil. Hablad con la vieja en la plaza. Speak to the old woman in the square. They found her sitting beneath a gnarled olive tree in the center of the village, wrapped in a shawl, feeding crumbs to pigeons. Her name was Abuela Mercedes, and her eyes were sharp despite her 93 years. Catalina, she said, almost before they could ask.
Yes.
I remember. She beckoned them closer. Your voice, it sounds like hers, she told Isabella. Soft, but defiant. Mercedes spoke slowly, with pauses that felt like prayers. She had been just a girl when the soldiers came to the cortijo. Catalina had been her teacher. They took her because she spoke too clearly, Mercedes said. They feared clarity, thought it contagious. What happened to her? Alejandro asked. The old woman looked toward the distant hills. There was smoke, then silence. But I heard her scream. Everyone did. And after that night, the fields never grew the same. Isabella leaned forward. Do you know why she was targeted? Mercedes reached into her bag and handed over a folded letter. The paper was yellowed and brittle. It had been written by Catalina. If you read this, I am gone. But the truth is not. They fear it because it does not die. It waits. Beneath ash, beneath stone, beneath silence. Isabella held the letter with reverence. It was a message meant to survive death. Mercedes's voice dropped to a whisper. There were others, too. Men who made her disappear. They were cursed. Each one. They heard voices before they died.
Couldn't sleep. Couldn't eat.
One by one, they vanished. The pigeons fluttered, disturbed by some unseen movement. Do you believe Catalina is still there? Isabella asked. Mercedes met her eyes.
She is not gone. She was changed.
She became something the silence could not swallow. As they left the square, Alejandro glanced over his shoulder. Mercedes had returned to feeding the birds. But as he watched, the pigeons had stopped eating. They stood still, staring at her. That night, they returned to the cortijo. The air was heavy, as if the house itself had drawn a breath and held it. The shadows stretched longer than they should have. Even the insects were silent. Isabella stood at the threshold, the key still cool in her hand. She had read Catalina's letter a dozen times already, committing every word to memory. Alejandro placed his torch against the stone wall. You still want to go in? Isabella nodded. We're not alone in this place. And we never were. Inside, the air smelt of damp wood and something older, like forgotten flowers crushed in a book. As they crossed the hallway, Isabella stopped. A soft sound, almost like weeping, drifted from upstairs. Alejandro froze. You heard that too? He whispered. She didn't answer. She was already climbing. The staircase groaned under their weight, each step creaking like it remembered pain. They followed the sound to a room at the end of the corridor. Its door was slightly open. Isabella pushed it. The room was empty. Dust covered every surface, and cobwebs hung like lace. But on the wall opposite the window, the plaster had cracked, exposing layers beneath. Letters carved into brick. They spelled one word: Mentora.
Lie.
Alejandro stepped closer. Who would write this? I think Catalina, Isabella said. Or someone trying to silence her. Alejandro turned his torch toward the wardrobe in the corner. Why do I feel like someone's still here? Before Isabella could reply, the door slammed shut behind them. They spun around. No one there. Then the weeping returned, louder this time, echoing from inside the wardrobe. It wasn't mechanical. It was breathy. Human. Alejandro reached out and slowly opened the door. Inside hung a single dress, pale and moth-eaten. On the floor beneath it, a photograph. It showed Catalina, smiling faintly, standing beside a man in uniform. His face had been scratched out violently. Her lover. Alejandro asked. No, Isabella said. Her betrayer. The weeping stopped. Then, in the silence, a new sound emerged, a soft, rhythmic tapping. It came from within the wall. Isabella placed her hand against it. It was warm. The tapping grew louder, closer, faster. She's trying to speak, Isabella whispered. She's still here, beneath all this. They left the room quickly, hearts pounding. But the sound followed them down the stairs, echoing softly from behind the walls, like someone crawling through stone. Outside, the wind had picked up. But it wasn't cold. It was hot. The earth beneath their feet seemed to pulse. They didn't sleep that night. The morning brought no relief. The sun rose pale behind a veil of gray clouds, casting a sickly light over El Canto. Isabella and Alejandro stood outside the village chapel, its weather-worn facade bearing the weight of centuries. The bells hadn't rung in years. Inside, the air was cool and heavy with incense long faded. Father Tomas awaited them, seated in the pews rather than the altar, as though he no longer claimed that sacred ground. His eyes, usually sharp, were tired. I read her letter, Isabella said quietly. Father Tomas nodded, without surprise. I feared it would resurface. You knew Catalina? Alejandro asked. The priest sighed. Better than I wanted. She was lightning in a storm. Too bright for this place. Too honest. Why did the village turn on her? Isabella asked. They didn't, not truly, he replied. But they let it happen. Because silence is easier than truth. He motioned for them to follow him. Through a narrow corridor behind the altar, they descended stone steps to a small archive chamber, its walls lined with shelves of brittle documents and locked cabinets. Father Tomas unlocked a drawer and retrieved a folder bound with twine. These were sealed by the archdiocese. I kept them hidden. Inside were photocopies of Catalina's journal, dozens of pages, a trembling script. She had documented everything: names, dates, confessions from the villagers who had used her as a scapegoat for their sins. Why didn't you come forward? Alejandro asked. Because I was one of them, Father Tomas whispered. Not one who accused her, but one who did nothing. I feared scandal. I feared losing my position. He turned to Isabella, his eyes glistening. I've lived with this for 30 years. She begged me to speak for her. I stayed silent. The room fell into a thick stillness. Catalina doesn't rest, Isabella said. The house, the walls, she's still trapped. The priest placed a hand over hers. Then we must finish what she started. Outside, the clouds grew darker. As they emerged from the chapel, the wind had changed. The trees bowed slightly, as if listening. They made their way back to the cortijo, this time with the journal clutched tightly in Isabella's hands. That night, as they read the final pages aloud, the walls of the house began to tremble softly. The tapping returned, but now it was slower, more deliberate. Not a cry, but a rhythm.
A knock. A reply.
A message. Alejandro tilted his head. She's guiding us now. Then, for the first time, Isabella felt it too, a presence no longer threatening but grieving. The truth was rising, and the house was awakening with it. The night passed without sleep. The cortijo pulsed with a strange energy, as though the walls themselves had begun to breathe. The final pages of Catalina's journal hinted at something buried beneath the house, beyond the reach of ordinary memory. Alejandro pried open the warped floorboards in the old kitchen with a crowbar. Dust billowed as centuries old wood groaned in protest. Hidden beneath crumbling stone, they found the mouth of an old well, its opening sealed with mortar and iron clasps. "This wasn't just forgotten," Alejandro said, brushing away the grime. "Someone made sure it stayed hidden." Isabella knelt beside him, holding a lantern. The edges of the well were lined with symbols, faded, but unmistakably protective sigils, some Christian, some older. They matched the ones Catalina had sketched in her journal. With Father Tomas's help, they broke the seal. The air that escaped was damp and cold, and smelled of ancient earth. A narrow staircase spiraled downward, cut into the rock. They descended slowly, the echo of their footsteps swallowed by the darkness. At the bottom lay a chamber, small, circular, lined with stone shelves. At its center stood a crude altar, blackened by time. Upon it, a bundle of cloth. Isabella approached, heart pounding. She peeled back the fabric slowly, revealing bones, small, delicate. "A child," she gasped. Catalina's final entry came flooding back. She had written of a girl named Marta, the daughter of a landowner. A child born of violence and discarded in secrecy. Catalina had tried to protect her, but failed. The villagers had feared the scandal more than the crime. "This is why she haunts the house," Isabella whispered. "Not for herself. For this child." Alejandro bowed his head. They buried the truth. Literally. A sudden gust of wind howled through the well, though no opening was visible. The lantern flickered violently, casting erratic shadows across the stone walls. A whisper rose from the dark. A single word, barely audible, "Perdón." Isabella felt tears prick her eyes. She reached out and touched the cloth gently. "You're not forgotten."
The chamber felt different then.
Not warmer but lighter, as though something had lifted. They carried the remains to the surface. The morning light had just begun to creep across the mountains when they stepped outside. A mist clung low to the earth, but the sky above was clear. Father Tomas arranged for a quiet burial in consecrated ground. No name, just a stone with a carved rose. Catalina had written that a rose was the symbol of remembrance. That night, the house fell silent. No knocks, no cold gusts, no whispers. But in the stillness, Isabella sensed something else. A presence. Not watching. Waiting.
The past was not finished with them yet.
The silence didn't last. 2 nights after the burial, Isabella awoke to the sound of footsteps. Not inside the house, but outside, slow, deliberate crunches on the gravel path beneath her window. She rose, heart thudding, and peered through the curtains. Nothing. But the grove whispered. The olive trees, gnarled and ancient, moved in the windless night as though stirred by unseen hands. She woke Alejandro and Father Tomas. Together, they took lanterns and stepped into the grove, guided by instinct more than reason. The light from the house faded quickly, swallowed by shadow. Midway through the grove, they found the stains. Dark streaks along the bark of an olive tree, too red to be sap. Alejandro touched it with a cloth. It came away wet. "Fresh," he said, his voice grim. Further in, a strange scent lingered, copper and roses. The ground bore marks of movement, as if something had been dragged. They followed the trail. It led them to an old stone wall at the grove's edge, part of a ruined shed from generations past. There, etched into the stones, were words. Not painted. Etched. With blood. Isabel. The name was spelled in shaky strokes, as though written by a trembling hand. Isabella stumbled back. "It's my name," she whispered. "But who?" Before she could finish, a low moan drifted from within the ruins. Not animal. Not wind. Human. Alejandro stepped forward with the lantern held high. The light fell upon a figure crouched in the shadows, a girl, maybe 9 or 10 years old, in a faded white dress stained with dirt. "Marta?" Isabella asked, barely breathing. The girl looked up slowly. Her eyes were wrong, too dark, too deep, like looking into a well with no bottom. She stood, but didn't speak. Her movements were fluid, almost graceful, but not entirely human. Father Tomas began to pray under his breath. Then she smiled. It was not a child's smile. The grove erupted into sound, branches snapping, unseen feet running, whispers rising from all directions. Alejandro pulled Isabella back, yelling, "Run!" They fled the grove, not stopping until the house was in sight. As they reached the door, a gust of wind slammed it shut behind them. Silence. Until a knock. One knock. From the inside. They turned slowly. In the kitchen, on the table, sat Catalina's journal.
Closed.
Isabella picked it up. Her name had been freshly written across the leather cover. It hadn't been there before. The next morning arrived heavy with fog, the kind that clung to the skin and muted the world like a shroud. Isabella hadn't slept. None of them had. The name on the journal had not faded. If anything, it looked darker now, as if it had sunk into the leather, becoming part of it. Father Tomas paced the floor of the sitting room, beads of his rosary sliding through his fingers like grains of sand. "I believe," he said finally, "that Catalina was not only speaking to the dead. She was hearing them. And not all of them came from heaven." Alejandro looked up sharply. "Are you saying she summoned something?" "I'm saying," the priest replied, "that something ancient has been disturbed. Something bound long ago." They agreed on one thing. The answer must lie beneath the chapel. The village chapel, abandoned for decades, stood on the edge of the property. Ivy smothered its walls, and its bell tower had long since collapsed, but the wooden door still groaned open. Inside, dust coated every surface. Broken pews. A shattered crucifix. And beneath the altar, exactly where the journal had hinted, stone steps descending. They lit torches and descended into the dark. The crypt beneath was small. The air was stale and heavy with mold. Stone coffins lined the walls, generations of Vega ancestors buried in silence. But at the far end of the room was something different. A second door. Made of iron. It bore markings they didn't recognize, twisting symbols like vines but sharper. Wounds carved into metal. Father Tomas traced them with his hand. "This is not Christian," he whispered. "This is older. Much older." Alejandro found a latch and forced the door open. Beyond it, a chamber, round and dry like a well. At its center lay a circle of salt, broken in one place. Within the circle, nothing. But the walls were covered in writing. Names. Dozens of names. Some they recognized from the village cemetery. Others were strangers. All were scratched into the stone. And near the top, in the largest hand, a final name had been added. Isabella. She stumbled back, a gasp catching in her throat. "No more," she said. "We seal this. Burn it, bury it, I don't care. Whatever Catalina started, we end it." But Father Tomas held up a trembling hand. "It's too late. Can't you feel it?" Above them, the sound began, a low thud, steady, like footsteps on stone. Then another. And another. They were not alone in the crypt. They never had been. The footsteps above slowed, then stopped, their echoes swallowed by the silence. Isabella, Alejandro, and Father Tomas stood frozen in the crypt's final chamber, hearts pounding. The broken salt circle before them seemed to pulse with something unseen, an energy, or a presence, or both. Then came the whisper. It didn't come from the corridor. It didn't come from the stairwell. It came from the walls. 100 voices. All at once. Whispering in a dozen tongues. Isabella clutched Alejandro's arm. "We need to get out." "No," said Father Tomas. "We must finish this." He pulled a small flask of holy water from his coat. Hands shaking, he began to chant in Latin, voice rising with each word. The voices in the walls grew louder. agitated. Then something moved inside the broken circle. Not seen but felt. A ripple in the air, like heat. A shape almost human. Then a face, briefly, a girl's face. Pale, with hollow eyes.
Catalina.
No, Isabella said softly. It's not her. Alejandro stepped forward, holding out his hand. We know your name, he said. You were never meant to stay. Let go. The figure writhed, the shadows twisting around it like smoke. The air in the chamber dropped sharply in temperature. Frost bloomed on the stone walls. Help me, the voice said, not a whisper now but a cry. But it came not from the girl, but from behind them. They turned. Behind them stood a figure, cloaked in shadow. Catalina, her real self. No longer the girl in the portrait, no longer the pale imitation in the salt circle. She looked older.
Worn.
Her eyes glistened with tears. I tried to save them, she said. I thought I could speak to them. But I brought something else instead. Father Tomas approached her, gently. It's not too late. Catalina nodded. She reached toward the broken circle. Her fingers trembled. Then she stepped inside. A flash of light burst through the chamber. The symbols on the iron door behind them glowed white-hot. The wailing voices shrieked once, long and sharp, before silence dropped like a curtain. When the light faded, Catalina was gone. The salt circle was whole again. They stood in the stillness, not speaking. Only the sound of breathing. And beneath it all, peace. A quiet that felt final. They sealed the chamber. They never spoke of it again, not to the villagers, not even to each other in the years that followed. But they all felt it. The difference. The silence in the air. The feeling that whatever had stirred beneath Casa de la Vega had returned to rest. And Catalina Vega, whispered of in the village for generations, finally became what she had once been before the darkness. A memory.